Very good. It's 1 o'clock, so thank you everybody for coming to the Tax-Exempt Review Committee. And we have kind of a short agenda, 3 items. And we'll start with number 1, approve Tax-Exempt Review Committee meeting minutes of 9/25/2018.
Move to approve.
Do we have a motion? Do we have a second?
Second.
I don't know if anybody has any comments or corrections. Otherwise, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Number 2, review and approve changes to pilot and TIF policies and downtown housing incentive area map. Jim, will you get us started on that?
Sure. As far as the downtown policy changes, what I sent out to you, or what we emailed out to you yesterday, was 3 sets of comments. The first was from Dan Madler with Beyond Shelter, the second with Mike Almendinger with Kilbourne Group, and the one that you see all marked up in red, that's from Austin Morris with Enclave. As I looked through these comments, and I do have a series of changes where I think they've made some good comments and that we should make some changes. On some of the other ones, it's more, I don't know if we can make these kind of changes, but I want to get your comments on that. So maybe first I'll just walk through the ones where I thought there was some comments that could be are good points that were in there. The first was on the TIF policy. There was a question of whether or not in our criteria we had sidewalks and bike paths and transit all in one, and I think my intention was that you could have one or the other of those. That was not clear, so that was a good point to clarify that. So in that TIF criteria, you'd meet that objective if you had either the sidewalk, bike paths, or if you had transit available nearby. Secondly, into the new commercial projects, there was a suggestion, and it should be 4 out of 8. What I'm suggesting instead is we add a 9th criteria that it would be for commercial projects that have good quality designs, and then that you would meet it if you had 5 of those 9. So you'd be essentially adding one more criteria, where if you went with good design, you'd meet that objective and be able to qualify for that TIF under that commercial policy.
So Jim, just a question on that. The TIFs are run through Finance Committee, correct? So if we don't vote those TIFs committee, we see them, we don't vote on them.
I think our intent is that they would come to this committee in the future, and along with the pilots, because sometimes they're working together, and rather than take people to 2 different committees,
right?
I think we'd still use our finance department and our finance committee if we were trying to make some distinction between, should they get 50% or 60% or 10 years or 5 years. Sometimes it's helpful to work that out with the finance committee before we bring the general project back to this committee.
Using language like quote unquote good design characteristics is somewhat subjective and broad. I'm not opposed to it, but that was my question of going to who is the board or the panel that decides what is good design characteristics. Do we define that further, or do you know when you see it, or 5 out of 9 votes or whatever it ends up being? But
I think on a lot of these that you know it when you see it. At least that's sort of how our policy reads, because trying to get down to define affordable housing, the different programs have different definitions, trying to define reasonable rate of return, an apartment project that's very much like another project, the reasonable rate of return might be lower because it's more predictable, where if someone is taking a risk and you don't know, creating speculative office space in the downtown or new retail space, that might be more risky, and a reasonable rate of return on that might be as high as over 20%. And so and it just like good design. So I think all of those, we had comments on all of those. Can you define what a reasonable rate of return is? Well, our financial advisors say, generally that's 10 to 15%, but it certainly can vary by the project. Affordable housing, we all have probably a different view of that. If you're trying to meet affordable housing need for a very low-income homeless population, that's a whole different criteria than if you're trying to be more of a workforce housing for, middle-income people. So I guess that's my general comment on that, is to leave these terms relatively general, and if that kind of gives us the flexibility, at least it sends a message to developers what's important, and then depending on the project, we can decide whether or not it's good enough for the incentive. So if you're comfortable with that, I'd like some of your thoughts on that.
I think we did kind of talk about that years ago on the low-income housing tax credit pilots. If you recall, we had that, the policy has the range of valuing them at a 5.5 gross rent multiplier to 6.5. And what we were trying to discourage with the higher gross rent multiplier and smaller incentive was just the box apartments with no amenities, like the community rooms and things like that.
So then the other policy, or one of the suggestions under the pilot policy, was to, rather than mention those HUD programs, that we just use the wording required by a land use restrictive covenant agreement. I thought we'd keep that other wording in place, but then add this also, is because in case there's an incentive that's not covered by those 3 programs. And then finally, under the UMU policy, add an objective to create attainable housing is one of the other objectives we'd be looking at. And then there was a policy number 5 with how much we would do with land write-down. That was different than the TIF policy, and so I think we should make both of those the same. And that had to do with how much of a land write-down you get, and I think we clarified the TIF policy, but I didn't clarify that UMU policy that I'd intended to. So I think that those are the changes that that I'd suggest. And then maybe I can just walk through these comments in general. And I think this first one with
Can you just tell us what your page you're on, Jim, just so we're all on the same page?
the comment from Dan Madler, if you have that one. If you turn to
On what, just, is there a
on the
page?
second- I don't think there's a second page.
Comments. Second.
I think comments page 2, if you see the red on the bottom.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for numbering these, Ben. One of the comments was, the but-for test, if we're requiring that for the low-income housing tax credit projects. We do have to pay our financial advisors to review these. The comment was that the $5,000 was a fee, or a PI fee, and an impediment. So I don't know if we want to consider having a lower fee for these low-income housing tax credit projects, or doing it at the city's cost. I just kind of throw that open for your comments or suggestions.
Any comments on that? I'll start out. I just think, I think that the intent of this was, it's mostly for businesses that those numbers are in effect. But I think for low-income housing, to me, that's a different part of our responsibilities. And so, to me, what I would like to have us do is to have this be done at the city's cost, if that sounds fair to everybody, because I just think that was kind of the original intent. Go ahead, Jim.
Just generally, there's only about 3 applications a year, so it wouldn't be a real high cost to have those reviewed.
Could I ask a question? When it notes in here that the application is between 25 and 40K, is that a separate fee that's paid for those low-income housing projects?
That's really not a fee. That's the cost for the developer, whether it be a nonprofit or a profit, to hire consultants, staff time. They're required to submit housing studies. So that's really their cost to put their application together.
And as I recall, the $5,000 was kind of an estimate, as I recall. But kind of the consultant just kind of does it based on hours or whatever. So we just kind of came up with that as an approximation.
Any other comments, Mark?
I'm wondering with low-income housing tax credit projects, if we could also have sort of a lower standard of effort for the but-for test. because it's really it's a review of their overall financials, and it's apparent that these programs will not work without some sort of assistance in the current market. So, is there a different test that we could actually have BFM perform on these projects?
I mean, it's probably the same test, but I think you're right. It probably takes less hours to do because they've already done a relatively thorough business plan. You know exactly what your rents are going to be. You don't have to question that because they're locked in. You know what your construction costs are. That's pretty predictable. And so it probably takes the lower effort. And one of the recent ones we did was really we're being billed like $2,600 for the review. And so, the ones that are the higher cost tend to be the more complicated mixed-use projects where maybe they don't have as much of their financials together. They haven't done as many marketing studies. And maybe just our reviewer has to go back and forth with them a lot on information.
Can I ask one thing too, Jim? There's got to be other cities that do this, and is there maybe a model that we can copy, or I guess that's something that we should maybe look at.
Yeah, I don't know if other cities require, but for actually in a lot of ways, the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency is also reviewing this to make sure that the amount of money is appropriate. So some of the information is already there for the Housing Finance Agency's review. So I don't think it probably takes that many hours to do for our consultant. And if they're doing 3 at a time, there's similar projects, there probably be some cost savings there. So.
This may be a silly question, but I'll ask it anyway. Are all low-income tax credit projects not-for-profit, or are there for-profit low-income tax?
There are for-profit. For instance, Commonwealth is a for-profit one. Some of these others are done by nonprofits, so they're both.
I would suggest maybe that would be a way to approach it, to charge the nonprofits less than the commercial ones, albeit functionally you could charge less for the whole book of business, but if somebody's doing it for profit, it seems like they should be paying at some modest fee.
That's good. Any other questions or comments?
I had a question on the low-income housing tax credit projects. Is the proposed policy that whether for-profit or nonprofit, they would be treated the same? We're treating them differently now.
If a nonprofit applied for the pilot, then they would be treated the same as a for-profit. Ben's point is that if you're a nonprofit, you automatically get a certain property tax exemption. You don't even have to do the but-for test, although it's probably not as valuable as the ones that we've provided for it under our policy. So some of the nonprofits have been considering applying for sort of essentially an additional tax incentive beyond what's already in state law.
Very good. Any other comments or questions?
The second comment on page 2 was having to do with that Lura to run with the land. I think that's a good comment, way to incorporate that in addition to the reference to HUD and North Dakota Housing Finance. On page 3 of the comments, the first item was more of a question, and it's yes, that these policies don't prevent the RZ from being in years 1 through 5 and pilots being in years 6 through 10. The policy number, comment on number 3 on that policy, when would we require, some sort of clawback and put that type of provision in? And really our policy says we might put that provision in, if there's an unusual, large project or where we feel it's necessary. And so the policy is, pretty, it's not real firm. It says we might do it, we might not. Generally, we have not done it, but the policy's in there so that if we ever felt it was appropriate, we could include some language to bring it back. Maybe it's the type of project where we are providing a really large incentive, but then we want to do a review because of the value of the incentive. So the language is not firm at all, and so I guess I thought we should just leave it the way it is. That way we can use it or not use it at our discretion. Generally, we have not used it for these pilots that have been from.
Can I just make a quick comment on that? So I think that's important to leave in there, and I think back, there's different varieties of this, but it was like, if a company promised to have 30 new employees and they don't follow through with that, there has to be a way to monitor that, and if there's some type of penalty, I mean, you have to have that, otherwise why? Do you get what I'm saying? I think it's important to leave in there, so that's just my opinion. I'd love to hear anybody else's comments on that.
No, I agree with you because, if we were providing it to someone who said they were going to provide, 10% low-income housing and they didn't do it, we'd want to have some way to draw that back if they didn't follow through.
Because from the legal perspective, if we don't have that in there, then we don't have any, there is no other option for us. So it's basically leaving that option of it open to us and at our discretion. And we, like you said, Jim, we don't use it very often, and really not at all, but I think it's important to leave in there just from our own legal perspective.
And what this is, I want to be clear that, for the people in the development community, it's just because we have it in a policy, the only way it's really enforceable is if we get the specific language and the specific agreement. And so I think there's a worry that we're just going to, after 5 years, say, no, we changed our mind, we're taking your thing away, because actually we have a firm agreement, and if we didn't put it in the beginning with that option, then we really don't have that option.
Is the presumption that we will have annual reporting from these projects? Or is it going to be only because some circumstance comes up that alerts?
It would only be if we actually put that provision in the agreement, and then we would do monitoring. If on most of these, we have not done the monitoring other than to make sure they build the project and they complete the project.
So in addition to the language that would include some potential clawback, there would be some expectation in terms of what the reporting would look like.
Yes.
And the timing of that.
That would all have to
the
be outlined in the development agreement. You go to page 4 of the comments. These one has to do with the I'll skip that first one because it's addressed in another section. One of the questions in comment 5 is how long will this policy be in effect? I think the only commitment the city commission could make is that, and Commissioner Grinberg has suggested this, we say we're going to leave this alone for at least 2 years until if there's another election comes along, and then we have change on the commission, it could change again. So, well, it'd be great if we could say we're not going to change it for 10 years. Our commission may change every 2 years, and so we can't really guarantee much beyond 2 years, and even then, the commission might change their mind. So,
But Jim, I would say this one's been in effect for quite a while, and so even though I agreed with what Commissioner Grinberg talked about when you have change in leadership, but usually this is, our anticipation is this is going to be left in effect for quite a while unless there's a reason to change it.
yeah, I think it would be nice to say we're going to leave this alone for 2 years, but then you might 2 years from now review it and say we're going to leave it again for another 2 years.
Right.
That was Commissioner Grinberg's comment.
But Jim, wouldn't the developers agreement, once it's approved, that lists the term trump any change in this? Because
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is more for future projects. Once we have a developer's agreement, we're locked into that, what we've agreed to.
And of course, legislation could change at any time.
I think it's like with the Renaissance Zone, someone buying property today that are going to do a project 3 years from now, they'd be nice if they knew for sure what's going to happen 3 years from now, but I guess we're just not that predictable. Comment on page 7 was, is this new? And I think this more of I can clarify that comment with the developer. The comments on page 6, and those were not new. At one point, we were going to lower the TIF assistance to 10%, and based on comments, we changed that back to 15%. Comment on page 9 of the comments. Again, that reasonable rate of return. Trying to define that specifically. I have not done that. The comments, we go to page 12. And I think that was a good comment to clarify that the sidewalks and bike paths that would not be both, but one or the other. Again, trying to find affordable housing. I've not done that. On comment on top of page 13, we're suggesting that we do 4 of 8. My comment was that we add a good design objective and then leave it at 5 of 9. One of the comments there is why primary sector. Just with these commercial projects that are now often downtown, that's sort of a bonus if you get primary sector jobs. Certainly, it notes the service sector jobs are more likely downtown, but again, the downtown criteria is the bottom half of the page. Again, there is a bonus there for primary sector, but you don't have to meet all the criteria. It's just you get a bonus if you meet that criteria. Go on to comments on page 15. Again, I'm not going to really try to define affordable housing, but I think it was good to add that objective for the attainable housing and incorporate that idea into it. The policy 4 is simply stating what is allowed within state law, what's eligible and what isn't. And so we can certainly provide those examples. Policy 5, I mentioned before, we clean that up and have the same policies we have under the TIF. Pages 18 and 19. This has to do with more how the rate of return is addressed and capitalized, and do you want some sort of an appeal process if the developer doesn't agree with our PFM analysis? And also, I'll invite you to comment on these. I know this gets into the financial review that beyond the finance classes I had, and how you calculate this rate of return. But I think for most of the developers we worked with, the PFM has been, done a good. I guess I haven't had these kind of concerns. What PFM does is they assume they're trying to figure out the rate of return for the first 10 years, and so there's an assumption that what the building would sell for 10 years from now doesn't mean you're going to sell the building, but they incorporate some gain into the building, and maybe it's a concern over how that gain is calculated.
Can I just jump in for a minute? All the red markings on here, this looks like a lot of my college papers when they were returned, so it looks very familiar to me. And the other thing I wanted to say is, so if we pass this we still will have an action at the city commission level, but if any of the developer, especially the people that wrote these, would like to meet with Jim, I would like to volunteer his time, and if you want any of us to be there too, I think that'd be good, just to clarify some of this, because some of these are specific questions by specific people, and so I appreciate them participating, but some of these are very specific things. Does that make sense to you, Jim, if that's okay with you? That if there are some specific questions that you're concerned about before we take action as a city, that is a good thing. So,
The
go
other
ahead.
thing, looking at them, is they are very specific, but we've breezed through them on a higher level. So to make sure that these are addressed appropriately, that
Right.
meeting does take place. So
Right.
we're not forgetting something that should be amended, should be changed, or should be added,
Yep.
that we're thoroughly understanding what they are. So we don't, if we're doing it, we should do it right the first time and make sure that we've counted for all of these if they are
And
valid
so
to be added.
that's an excellent point. And so the other vision that I have is this, we're going through this, like you said, we're going through this at a fairly high level. And so I believe that this should come back to us one more time before we have it go on to the city commission, just because it's the same thing. There's a lot of minutia in here, and I do think they're individual things, but they would apply to the group as a whole. And so I don't know if that makes sense to everyone else, but that's kind of, because the other thing is, we shouldn't rush through this because it's very important things, and so that's.
I know, Mayor, you were concerned about trying to get the TIF policy through as soon as possible, and a lot of these comments have to do a little bit more with the UMU policy. I don't know if you'd be comfortable moving ahead with the TIF policy to City Commission, and then, the other thing with this pilot policy, Ben has this, policy guide. It'd be good to work these in here and rather than have an attachment. So maybe give us until the next meeting to incorporate them into this book. But I think we're working on another downtown TIF, and so I'd like to get the TIF policy moved ahead. There were probably less comments on that.
Does that make sense to everybody else? Because I just, it's also important for us to have policy in place. So go ahead, Bruce.
And I agree. This got a lot of political and public attention, and I think to put it out for comments, to get comments, even if they're very few, to not pay attention to them or somewhat respond to them, I think makes it look like we weren't really trying all that much. So I agree with you, Dave.
So is that okay if that's okay with you, Jim, that I would like to have them meet one, because I mean, you're the one that this is your wheelhouse, and so, instead of having us all participate, but then having it come back to us as a group, if that's, I don't like when people commit my time, but I just think that would be the most efficient way, if that's okay with you.
No, I think that would be fine, whether you want to bring them both back to you. I'm just trying to think of how to move these along, again, with the pending TIF idea in this riverfront area.
Any other comments or any other input on that? But there's a couple of specific individuals that I would like to have meet with you, and I think that would be much more efficient to answer their questions directly, because some of it is very
Yeah, and
specific.
if I could, maybe volunteer Kent's time too, and bring our financial advisor in to have a discussion on these. So.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, Jim.
Look at you.
Okay. Go ahead, Ken.
I just had a curiosity question under the comments submitted by Mike Almendinger under 3B, evaluation criteria for downtown mixed use, that seemed to have to do with non-financial related information. And I just wondered what the spirit of that comment was, Mike, if you could address that.
If you want to sit down, Mike, wherever you want. That's
So how and where we build and relative amenities and others, non-financial information, how does that relate to qualifying for a TIF? I was curious about that.
Yeah, sure. So again, Mike Almendinger with Kilborn Group, and this comment was just related to design standards. I think there was a part in here that was talking about some standards of design that would meet, to meet the qualifications of the project. And I think right now it relates back to the Renaissance Zone criteria, which I think is a good set of criteria that the city has in place. One of them that has been discussed that I know from others is, parking on the first floor of projects for apartments specifically. And I think that's where, I think there's many different variations of that. But if we can encourage, and this just basically comes back to the in-focus plan and then the master's plan that was completed. I know one of their key components was encouraging some sort of future development to occur on the corner of those projects. I don't think it's going to happen everywhere in downtown Fargo. If you go over to 10th Street area or University area, it makes sense to have projects with parking on the first floor. But if you can have the corners with some sort of potential retail or maybe amenity space for that apartment, I think that's just a good design. So it was trying to reinforce that in-focus plan that's already in place.
Thank you.
I think we addressed that just a little bit under those comments on the page 13 of the comments in the criteria for the downtown mixed use. You know, the second bullet there is that the project's compatible with the adjacent area, and so I think we do get into the design a little bit as we review these, and anytime we approve a project, we try to, you know, get specific on what what it's going to look like. So if they bring in a certain design, we make sure that design is part of the incentive. So I think those are some good comments, and you may want to look at these more through the land development code as well as our criteria versus a kind of a financial part of that.
I think just maybe at a high level, I think if you're applying for, if you're applying for a pilot or some sort of incentive, that there is some design criteria that is met to meet the city's goals and, the master plan that's in place for the city.
And because it's so subjective, if we give examples about what great design or good design looks like, because that is subjective. So if we
Yeah.
can, even not saying that these are the criteria, but here are examples of our definition that meets the bigger picture of what great design is,
Yeah.
then they can emulate that or figure out what works for them or doesn't based on their project.
So my experience, whenever we've applied for a Renaissance zone, there are design criteria in the Renaissance zone. I think those are good criteria, but I don't see them transferred over to the pilot. So maybe that would be a place to review if the same criteria, apply to pilot applicants as well.
Very good. Any more, Jim?
Nope. It's your pleasure.
So as a kind of a plan going forward, does that make sense with everyone, that we have individuals meet with their specific issues, and then it will come back to us, and then so we'll have another opportunity for public input again, but then after that, after we take action, then it goes on to the city commission. Does that make sense to everybody?
Okay.
And I apologize for it taking a long time, but I just think it's very important, and I think it's good to listen to everybody to make sure we're going the right way. The other thing I wanted to talk about was that for the larger projects, having us have a meet where the Renaissance Zone and everybody meets together every so often, I think that would be a good thing to do. And so that's another thing. Any other comments, Mark?
This may be a specific question for Jim, but on comments page 17, we have the comment under policy 5 about the total acquisition cost, and they have the question about, what if there's multiple properties?
Sure.
And in the TIF policy on page 7 under policy 6, there's an extra sentence in there, and
Yeah, and that was my comment, that we should really take what's under policy, basically take policy 6 and replace it.
So
with
the language
5.
here, these 2 bullets replace the 3 back here.
Right. So they'd be consistent. Okay.
Any other comments? Otherwise, we have one more item on the agenda, and then we're done, and that's the county has a kind of working on the same issues that we are, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I don't know Jim, if you were going to talk about that, or are we going to, go ahead.
The Commonwealth Development, we had informed the county about that application. That's the 47, 48 unit apartment building that would be up on 5th Avenue North. The city commission last night approved it. It's the low-income housing tax credit project, for-profit developer Commonwealth. The county did not really act either way. There was a motion to deny, there was a motion to approve, neither got a second. And so we're in a situation where we're sort of in this negotiation period that's allowed under state law. I think it's been pointed out, it's unclear should the developer be negotiating with the county or should the city. But it represents about $11,000 a year in extra taxes for Commonwealth if the county does not participate. So I just wanted to, Aaron Anderson is here with Commonwealth, Commissioner Peterson's here with the county, and so I thought we could have some discussion or see if there's some questions. Maybe Aaron, it sounded like their developer, it's more important to have to know what your property taxes are going to be for 15 years. So the county was comfortable with 5 years, but then it makes it hard for the developer if it jumps up in year 6, and maybe a lower level for 15 would be better than 0 for 5, and then the higher taxes in years 6 through 15. I don't know, Chad, do you want to kind of address why you think the county did not want to participate? And
while
Aaron,
Chad's coming up, if you don't mind if I jump in real quick. So part of it is, this isn't the same as a business. This is low income, it's housing for homeless people and low income people. So my perspective is we have to look at this different than if we're doing a TIF for a business or a pilot or whatever. That's just my 2 cents. And Chad's comes at it from the accounting perspective, and so he's a lot smarter than I am on all that. But my opinion is we have to treat these different than if we are looking at an apartment or a business or something like that. This is low-income housing. So that's my editorial comments, and I didn't mean to step on your toes, but I just think it's the federal, and maybe you can talk about this, the federal rules and things are different for these than they are for other things. So, all right, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for my attire. I didn't realize I was supposed to be here until about an hour ago when my boss said, "So your chairman can't be here. What are you doing?" So here I am. I think, just speaking more philosophically than anything else, I think the baseline, again, just one person talking, I'm not trying to represent the commission, but philosophically, the 5-year window, I think the city, county has to acknowledge there's a cost savings to us as public officials and to our neighbors investing in infill. What's that credit back? Well, that's a 5-year tax incentive to help our city and area move forward. I think the struggle gets to be when you're 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The logic being if you're out that far, my logic being, and I think Commissioner Steen's the same thing, the logic being if you're out 10, 15 years, they're never going to be viable. One of the things we brought up in our last commission meeting regarding this project in specific was they gave us a lot more data, exactly the data I wanted to see. It was wonderful. And unfortunately for them, which is why I voted no, it had all the information in it I wanted to see. There's, I'm going from memory, a $776,000 developer fee, which again, profit is okay, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is that when you come to us, our neighbors, and ask for our money, what is a reasonable profit? And I think that was referenced in the comments too. What is good, what is bad? Architects' fees, contractors' fees. This isn't a charity. No one's doing this out of the goodness of their heart. It happens to have a good product in the end that I think is needed regarding low-income housing, but if they're coming to me and asking for $14,000 a year and the developer is going to make almost $1 million, I'm struggling supporting that. Now, if they were coming in and saying, here's the deal, we're a nonprofit, a legitimate nonprofit, we're going to make $100,000 on this, architects can make 1%, contractors can make 1%, we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart because it's a good thing and we need it. Give them the money. I think I can validate the county not supporting this because they're building the project we voted against. The cities and schools voted for it. The schools didn't vote. The city voted for it and the school followed the city. But if the but-for thing is literally cut and dry, they didn't need it because they're building it. And the struggle is, like I said, the messaging behind it. We're doing low-income housing. We're doing these feel-good things that I think we all acknowledge something has to be done. But my contention is there's other things that can be done in planning code. You could allow developers to do smaller lots. I'm sorry, not everybody needs a bike path. That'd be great if everybody had a giant park in their backyard. Some of the developments I reference are up in North Fargo where I grew up, by Hornbachers. The houses that were built after the war. There's no parks. There's a park over here, there's a park over there, but there's no bikes in the back. There's no bike paths in parks. Small houses, small lots. And again, I'm way off the point here, but I think philosophically speaking, I can't support projects like this when everybody's making this kind of money. If they're coming in and not making money and legitimately need it to work, okay. And I acknowledge, in all cases, almost all cases, 5 years is reasonable because they're doing a project that's costing them more in lieu of a greenfield development somewhere. So they should be incentivized for that. I don't dispute that. And may I say this too, and I actually texted my administrator about this, whether it's housing, whether it's whatever, there's never going to be an always no. If Amazon wants to build their headquarters in downtown Fargo, and they want 20 years of no income tax or no property taxes, yeah, I'm okay. I'd support that because that is a game-changing, massive investment in this community that will never go away. but an apartment in downtown Fargo with a vacancy rate of 12%, that they're not coming in at $300 a month for rent, $400 a month for rent. It's market rate for the most part. I'm struggling supporting that, and maybe that's too cut and dry, too black and white, I don't know, but that's one person talking from the county commission's perspective, and like your planner said, I didn't get a second on my no. So there's a middle ground somewhere.
So let me just counterpoint to you a little bit. So this isn't just apartments, this is low-income housing apartments, and for 8 of the apartments, it's for homeless people. And so this isn't just an apartment investment in downtown Fargo. And if we don't make a commitment for low-cost housing and workforce housing and all that stuff, we're not going to have any. And so this has to be a priority. This shouldn't be looked at like any other business. These credits and all this is very difficult to come by. And so if we start turning them away, we're not going to have any look. And 50 years ago, the low-cost housing was in downtown Fargo, and now it's flipped. And so we have to make and I'm speaking as a commission, I'm not trying to tell you guys how to vote, but I'm just saying, if we don't make this a priority, we're not going to have any, because the real estate, the cost of land is too high in the downtown. So that's just my opinion, that I think we as a group have to make this be a priority. And it's my main concern is, in many parts of the country, the people that work in our businesses downtown have to live far away, and that we want them to live where they can walk to work, and so that's my perspective anyway. So, and I know you're looking at it from the economic and from the business, and I think sometimes we can't always just look at that. That's my point of view.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, real quick, yes and no. I think the recounter would be, is there a better way to do it, rather than incentivizing growth? You've heard me say this during the Renaissance Zone meetings. The irony of the Renaissance Zone is, we had to create a Renaissance Zone in downtown Fargo because no one would do anything down here. It cost too little to bring up too much. And we've now completely flipped that to the point where everything is so expensive no one can afford to do anything. I think that's time to say home run. And we talked during one of my first Renaissance Zone meeting is moving these around the city. My goal would be to do this on University from 13th Avenue South to 32nd Avenue South. Get people going where they're not going. I think the downtown area has been an amazing success left and right. I owned the first project that was built down here under Renaissance Zone money. I spent more of my cash out of my pocket because of that cash.
But let me just comment on that. So the Renaissance Zone, it's a success. So as political entities, what we want to do is keep doing things that are successful. So my correlation is, when the Bison are running the football and winning the game, they don't say, you know what, let's just change our philosophy because we're too successful. And so the Renaissance Zone, and the other thing is, the downtown, there is no end. The downtown, this is the heart of our city. This is the heart of our state. And you have to keep working at it. We are the heart of West Fargo. If people go out downtown, do you know where people go downtown in West Fargo? Downtown Fargo. It's what makes us unique. South Fargo is awesome, but South Fargo could be South Rochester. Our downtown, and it's going to be we have to continually work at it. So, and it's a philosophical difference, but I'm just saying, but we also have to work at if we have gentrification and all the people that work downtown have to live far away, that many parts of the country are having this issue, and so we have to address it. All right, Mr. Mayor.
Just a couple things. Chad, in some ways, as I understand your objections to it, is there's too much profit to this corporation. As you read the figures, that's what you read. And I think also the county, some of the members, 15 years is hard for them to do that. Structure of the tax incentive policy is 15 years, so we're trapped on that a little bit. There's going to be 3,000 to 5,000 people that need to move downtown because of the work that's going to be done downtown. So you may say there's a 12% vacancy. We say there's a need for more apartments. The downtown study that came out, and that's what's out there right now, is we have to have more affordable housing. And Bruce and I were talking about this at lunch, is, what is affordable housing right now? $700 a month, $800 a month? It's hard to know. We're all a little bit biased to think from our times it was $300, $400, $500, but it's gone up. I mean, Dave's son has an apartment downtown, and it's over $1,000 a month, as far as I understand. So as we talked to the developer, we were told last night that this would hit many of the people in income brackets that could work, single mom, 2 children, somebody working as a cook downtown, different things that we are going to have in the community. I think 2 things we'd need, Jim. I think we'd have to go with Chad and see where his objections are and see what we normally do, because to me, we're usually pitched this. Last night, we were told that if this was not given the pilot status, the project wouldn't go. We were told the $1 million was critical to this project going forward. So there's a disconnect, because in my mind, you're saying, oh, they're making piles of profits. They don't really need even the pilot. And then just Dave's second point is developers do look for areas, and they can invest in Fargo. Jim knows this. They can invest in Fargo, Omaha, any variety of different places, and if Fargo starts shutting down pilots, they will quit investing downtown. The Renaissance Zone, as Jim and I have gone over it, has decreased the tax burden of the taxpayers in the county and in the city by 4%. So the success that it's had has worked well, but if people start not coming here because there's not opportunities, we will lose that success. And Dave Bison running game, that's similar to that. It's hard to know, do you shut the faucet off? But I think the economics are not as great as you think. And if we could kind of bring that argument to you and hit those with Springstead or whoever, so that we can have a good dialogue about that. Because from our perspective, we're viewing it as if we don't get a pilot, this project doesn't go forward. In the city commission room last night when we discussed it. And we have many of our commissioners, John Strand, who's on community development, he's crying out there that this is a huge need in the community. So when we're hearing that from our perspective, we feel we're not helping the community in some of our biggest needs, homeless and low-income people. So Jim, I'll let you comment.
I think it was clear that if the city did not take the action they did last night, this project would not go forward, because what they approved was basically 80% of that tax reduction. The question for Chad is, if we were to get their financials and send them to PFM and look at that analysis and say, what's the rate of return with and without the county incentive, would that help you make a better, or make a decision? Would you be more comfortable with that that information? Because these tax credit programs, the way the state works, the federal rules are that the project has to stay low income for 15 years. The state adds on another 15 years. Is that correct? So it's 30 years. And so, there's a certain development fee that's built in, but what's the risk? Well, if it costs too much, it comes out of that fee there. And so there's a certain risk in building these projects. And I don't know how they turn out, but I just wondered if we'd send this to PFM and have them analyze it, do you think that would help county kind of get off this impasse of approving it, not approving it, and see what the difference is?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that doesn't hurt. More information is always better. Like I said, the very first project we had was the building that's being built right now, and that was 3 pages and $1 million. I've used that, and I'll use that for the rest of my life. It's a great example of here's nothing, give me money. And I think followed with what they provided us now is better, but the more information you can dump on us, absolutely the better. And to some degree, let's be honest, this is almost silly to a degree, because we're talking about a minimum amount of money relative to what the city is talking about, the city or the schools are talking about. But it's a principled argument, and we may disagree on that. I would contend in my football analogy that Bison run up 72 points passing. What do? They go to the run. They don't keep passing. So we're still running up the score. And I think there's a balance that we need to achieve. And again, I really struggled. Mayor Mahoney, you and I have talked about this. There's a level of uncomfort I personally have, because I'm feeling like I'm meddling in city business. And I don't know how to make that right, because here I am as not an outsider, because we all live in Cass, but I kind of am. So what I do for a living, what I represent as a county commissioner, my philosophy is what it is, I guess. And there's 5 of us, so there's always more often than not, I'm going to be on the 2 to 3 than I am the 3
But
to 2.
Ted, the other thing is, I want us to all be on the same page. And I know we're separate entities, but especially, so we want to be sending the same message. And to me, these are not apartments, just random. This is not building an apartment in downtown Fargo. This is low-income housing and homeless housing. That should not be looked at as the same investment I as a business or someone relocating. Do you know what I'm saying? And so, and I totally agree. I don't think we should ever look at meddling. I think we all want to be on the same page. That's my main thing. At the same time, I don't think you should vote how you vote and we should vote how we vote. But I just think this is a big deal, and this is us sending a message as a group. And this is about homeless housing and people that are on very low income having a place to live in downtown Fargo. So that's my speak. Ken.
I had a question or maybe a comment related to the but-for test. So when we do a but-for test, PFM is tasked with looking at the cash flows, looking at the assumptions, validating that what the developers are using are reasonable assumptions. So in this case, or a case like this, wouldn't they be flagging and looking at the $700,000 development fee that is buried within the heart of the analysis? And if they thought it was out of mark, wouldn't they be responsible to comment to say, this is a great project, it fits within our parameters 10 to 15%, but oh, by the way, the developer fee is twice as high as it should be? I mean, is that, we're paying them to do that, aren't we?
That's what they would be doing is, they'd look at what the standards are in the industry, probably what a nonprofit might put in for development fees. I think the nonprofits also have the same development fee and they have many of the same costs. But
So
I
my
think that would
question-
be something that BFF.
Yeah, my
could
question is, would it be helpful to the county to know,
Aaron can address.
to know that those assumptions are being validated, so we don't just simply have a difference of opinion? That here's a factor that's key. Let's hone in on the factors that you're having trouble with and discern whether they're within market or not. And maybe that's just the dangers in the details and how people are looking at it. But it seems to me we're doing the work. We're paying a professional to look at the pro formas, and if he comes out with a result, if there are areas that a developer can extract money through the project, then maybe we should ask them to comment on those specific items and say they're either within market or they're not, and just lay it out there so this committee can decide how you want to proceed.
Wouldn't you think that'd be a question probably even before you send the but-for, if they do a different kind of analysis on low-income housing tax credit than a market rate? Because the structure is quite different than a normal apartment project. I mean, if they've done if they've done the but-for in the past on projects like this.
Yeah, and that's my assumption is they have, and if they have, it would seem like they should flag something that isn't within the boundaries of a normal transaction, and we're paying them to do that. So maybe we just need to focus on that but-for a little bit more, and just say locally we're hearing some input about the components of the business model, the components of the cash flow, and all those items, and just please comment.
Yeah, if Commonwealth is willing to provide us with that information, we could send it to PFM. And maybe the other, just before I have Aaron address what you'd like to talk about, and Ben, maybe you can give us an example. For instance, this project, if it was a market rate apartment, you'd have it at about 5.7 million. What we're proposing here is it'd be at 2.1. If this were developed by a nonprofit, what would their property taxes be based? Would it be, from my understanding, it'd be even lower?
While Ben's looking that up, maybe I'll give you an opportunity to talk, because it kind of feels like when you're sitting in the room and everyone's talking about you, but you don't get to say anything. So maybe if you want to just say some of the things while you've been sitting here waiting, what you'd like to say, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Erin Anderson with Commonwealth Development. Appreciate the opportunity to briefly respond here. So for starters, our average rent is $703. I consider that below market. It's also averaging at 53% area median income. That's low income according to the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Guidelines. So that's the baseline, is that this is affordable housing. When we get into the discussion about how much profit is involved in this project, the $776,000 is about 7%. The state restricts us to no more than 10%, and we typically can't make a project financially feasible at that maximum amount. 7% certainly well within the guidelines, significantly below the guidelines. A nonprofit affordable housing developer coming into this project would likely pursue the same, if not more, developer fee. I mean, they're going to have the same risks that we have. If they're going to be involved in the project, they're going to have overhead and they're going to have risk involved, and they're going to look at that and say, well, we can have up to 10%, just the same as a for-profit developer. This is usually you're working the analysis backwards to determine how much profit's reasonable. So some of the other areas, I know there was some concern about how much our architecture fee is. You know, that 4% for architecture does include civil engineering, structural engineering, mechanical, all the MEP rolled up into that. So at the end of the day, the actual architectural fee is quite a bit less. When we look at the actual issue at hand, the $11,000 a year difference between the county, if the county participates or not, we end up, if I run the numbers and we look at that additional amount of a first mortgage, we can, the additional debt service the project can support with or without that $11,000 ends up equating to about $300,000 today. And that's significant. That's significant dollars for us. Currently, with construction interest rates rising and additionally looking at the way that the investment market is going right now in these affordable housing tax credits, if we were to take out the county's participation, we'd be deferring about 62% of that $776,000 fee, which is equivalent to deferring $484,260, which would mean we would only actually take $291,000 worth of fee. If I was to go to my project review committee in my company and say we're deferring 62% of the fee, they would say this is a no-go. Furthermore, we wouldn't be able to get the project approved through any investor and actually through North Dakota Housing Finance Agency because the deferred fee needs to be realistically expected to be paid back over a certain period of time because the investor actually expects that a certain amount of, usually they could look at no more than 25% of that fee to be deferred. Otherwise, it's considered an additional risk on the project because that deferred fee ends up being, you know, it's a, what is it? A liability, basically, on the project. Let's see. I think that covers most of the
So I don't
concerns.
If anybody has any questions, and Chad, maybe you have any specific ones, but otherwise, if they can give you as much information as possible, that's what you're looking for.
Yes, sir.
So,
Okay. Thank you.
I would suggest that Chad, and I think you're going to do a subcommittee or somebody come over, talk to us, just get the people in the room so we can talk
Correct.
and visit. And then we can go through it a little bit more detail. Jim, we can get the right people in the room, and I think, I mean, we normally, a low-income project, that's almost unanimous in this commission, in this meeting, it's almost unanimous in the city commission because we don't get too many. And when the West was going, and you were out there in Williston, I mean, they took a lot of it out west. Now we're starting to finally get it back into Fargo. And when we look at our needs, we have 850 people homeless every day. So we need to get people moved into some kind of house.
Ben?
In answer to Jim's question, okay, with this pilot, if the county participated fully, the pilot and land tax would be about just over $30,000. Without the county's participation, the pilot and land tax would be about $41,500. If this were a nonprofit and exempt under statute where they pay 5% of gross income less utility expenses, it would be $14,481. So about half of what would be paid under this with full participation by the county.
But the other thing I also heard from many of the commissioners is not necessarily they're not going to participate at all. Some of them could put out maybe the 5-year or 10-year participation or something modified. And my assumption in our discussion is that we're going to try to discuss what you guys feel comfortable with. Is that right, Chad?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there's been no resistance from any one of the members for 5 years or less, not an inkling. It seems as though that's the baseline of any, and I think it's based, again, sort of commonsensically in my mind, but maybe too bluntly in other people's minds. Renaissance zone. Anybody can apply, anybody can afford it. All you have to do is move to where we think you should move. You don't have to be rich, you don't have to be poor, you don't have to be in business 20 years or 5 years. Anybody can benefit from the Renaissance zone. I think that's sort of the baseline is 5 years seems to work. So I've not heard anybody say 0, of the 5 of us anyway.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, I would just want to also share what Chairman Steen shared with me. He regretted not being able to be here today as well. And his message to me was 5 years, yes, 10 years, maybe, 15 years, no. And so that's I'm hearing on our side a fairly clear message.
Jim?
Just have Aaron address that, explain why your project for your investors is better to spread 15 years even if you don't get 100% of it.
Yeah, and in fact, and I always say investor, but it's actually the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency too. The way that they're evaluating projects is with level expenses every year, the same amount of expenses. Variable expenses over the 15 years are not allowed. And so instead of a 5-year or a 10-year, if that ends up being the direction that the commission goes, we would actually need to look at just reducing the payment and then averaging it out over 15 years, because unfortunately we can't work with anything less than 15 years. We would be required by the state and by the investor both to put a reserve aside for whatever the difference is for those years where the property taxes go up.
Let us negotiate how we come out.
But so that goes back to the whole thing that I think we need to, this is a unique situation and it's a unique thing. It isn't, you know what I mean? This isn't, and so it's kind of like we have our communication crossed with the state because they are requiring 15 years of a fixed, and
They want consistency.
and so that's what's, I think it's causing a little bit of confusion. And so I think we need to clarify things, kind of like our last topic. That's just part of it. I just think it's, we have kind of a mixed thing. And so I think we'll all work on it together. And I appreciate you being here, Chad. And I do think open communication with all of us ends up with a better product in the long run. And so thank you, everybody, for being here. Is there anything else other than, I'll let the staff be in charge of us. I think we have to have a lot of meetings one-on-one to kind of clarify some of this stuff. But then before our next meeting, we'll come back and hopefully a lot of these will be addressed. Go ahead.
One other thing that I would raise, and Mark raised this idea with me a month or so ago, that as part of our commission calendar on our first and third Mondays of the month when we hold our commission meeting, earlier in the afternoon we have various committee meetings, and we talked about having these pilot reviews or economic incentive reviews scheduled maybe on a every 2-month calendar. If there's not a project in queue that needs to be discussed, that could drop off, but have something that was on a calendar on a consistent basis where that would be a first opportunity to review and question and talk about that. And I think we're supportive of that. I've held off only because for administratively it might be cleaner to start that when we start a new year, new chairman, new process. But I think that from our side could help the discussion.
I think that's a great suggestion, and I think that all of us being in the same room, then we could ask, it would be a lot less confusing for the people that are proposing the project, but also everybody has good questions and they would apply. So I think that's a great idea. And so should be our goal to try to, in the new year, to kind of, that'd be a good plan. So with that, okay, come on up to the podium real quick. We're running out of time. We're on overtime. We're time and a half pay, so go ahead.
No, just interesting discussion, and wanted to share just a quick tidbit. Just from a guidance standpoint on low-income housing tax credit projects, as she very well knows, when I look at a project, I've modeled low-income housing tax credit projects in the downtown community. And I just want to emphasize that, one, the developer's fee or developer's profit, you have to look at that as a gross margin, because there's significant costs that are never recoverable from staff time. These projects take twice as long to get approved than a typical market rate. So you look at that developer's fee and you actually look at the staff that they have that has to go through the process to get LIHTC approval at the state level and federal. They're not making 700 grand. Two, I'd just say from a project cash flow or return standpoint, totally different. The guidelines restrict debt service coverage to 1.25 as like the maximum on a project like that. So the investor's side doesn't look the same as a market rate project. So I just wanted to state that because it's interesting when you model it out. The reason the fees are the way they are on LIHTC compared to market is that there isn't margin on the ongoing operations. So when we modeled like a $7.5 million LIHTC project downtown, our annual cash flow after debt service, after looking at how it would function, was the equivalent to about 25 grand a year. And when you look at a normal down payment of $2.5 million, you make one mistake on operations, you have one little blip in vacancy over a short period of time and you're at zero. So when you look at that, I'm just speaking on behalf of LIHTC, the way it's structured, the benefit is the tax credit. That's why people do them. And they're just hoping that the project can make enough cash flow to sustain itself over that period of time and make a nominal return. So when you look at it, nobody's getting rich off of that. The fee side is a way to make the projects actually feasible, to have companies like Commonwealth and companies like Beyond Shelter and companies like, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, pay their overhead, pay salaries, and pay what I would consider a normal profit. If I were to do a development project market rate and my developer fee would be 4 to 6% or 6 to 7%, if I were to do a LIHTC deal, it'd be 10, because it's much more difficult. It takes way more resources, it takes way more staff, and they're challenging. So I just wanted to say that because I think from the county's perspective, from the city's perspective, there is a reason why there isn't 10 developers lined up at the door going, well, let's build 300 affordable units because they're needed in Fargo. Even if the need is there, it's so challenging, and most of them don't work, especially in the non-competitive tax credit arena where you're trying to get the 4%, which is given out. Why aren't those existing? Why don't you have 4% guys all over the place? All of them are, for the most part, a lot of them are competitive. So I just wanted to share that as a market rate developer. I've never developed LIHTC, and I have trouble making it work. So just food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Otherwise, thank everybody for coming. Have a good afternoon. We are adjourned.